with long periods of fasting. The more rigorous his practice of self-mortification, the weaker he became physically and distraught in mind. But impressed by his determination, 5 ascetics tended him in his most excruciating practices. Soon, the princely ascetic realized the futility of self-mortification and decided to adopt the middle path of avoiding both extremes of self-indulgence and self-torture. As he grew in strength and mental stability, his 5 attending ascetics abandoned him. Alone, he proceeded with his efforts, and at the age of 35 attained full enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya in India. Thus, he achieved the status of a Buddha, a fully awakened or enlightened sage, and a teacher of men and gods. He went in search of the 5 attending ascetics and delivered to them at Isipatana, in modern Sarnath near Varanasi, the first discourse, aptly designated the Rolling of the Wheel of Doctrine. In his teachings, he analyzed the reality of human existence as comprising impermanence and perpetual change, causing unsatisfactoriness and misery, and thereby underscoring the futility of the notion of self. He presented the 4 noble truths of suffering to be realized, the cause of suffering, which is craving that had to be eradicated, the end of suffering in Nibbana to be attained, and the Noble Eightfold Path to be practiced. His systematic process of mental development led the practitioner to the attainment of self-realization and enlightenment through virtue and moral purity, mindfulness, and concentration of the mind. This was taught to those who opted to follow his path of deliverance. To the laity, he taught a path of moral purity leading to a better life here and hereafter. The Buddha had as much to say on life here and now as on spiritual progress to salvation. Standing before humans as a human with no claim to divine or supernatural power or connection, the Buddha taught a path which every man, woman, or child could follow, and presented an ideal of perfection which was within everyone's reach to be attained with nothing but one's own effort and determination. One is one's own master was his clarion call to humanity. One has to attain one's salvation by one's own effort, for the Buddhas were only the pointers to the path. He relied on the critical acumen of all people and placed even his own teachings for examination with the invitation, "Ehipassiko, come and see for yourself." Think for yourself, he underscored, and let the good and benefit of the many be the only criterion. His way of life had no place for dogma or blind faith. He recognized the multiplicity of spiritual paths and studiously avoided the slightest inclination to conversion. He believed that all religious teachers could lead their disciples to heaven and enjoined them to do so. Founding the Sangha as a self-renewing, self-sustaining democratic society of dedicated men and women, submitting to a stringent code of discipline of restraint and selfless service, the Buddha initiated the earliest known missionary movement in the world. Go forth on missions, O monastics, for the good and the benefit of the many. He enjoined the Sangha, and it has remained for over 2,600 years an extraordinarily effective spiritual movement and force. The missionary zeal of the Sangha is as strong today as it has been in its long and peaceful history. Neither a central authority nor organizational control was ever established. The Buddha agitated against the prevailing caste system of India, where people were occupationally and socially compelled by birth to rigid restrictions and hardships. To emphasize the equality of all humans, he set the example of admitting to the Sangha candidates from all castes and classes, and established seniority of membership as the only standard of precedence. Similarly, he recognized the intellectual and spiritual potential of women and enabled them to be active members of the Sangha. In his numerous discourses on life issues, he upheld for every person the right to education, the right to work, the right to freedom, and the right to choose a religion. With precept and example as his principal tools of agitation and public education, he led an effective movement against all forms of social barriers and discrimination, intolerance and prejudice, exploitation and oppression. Declaring that all sentient creatures feared violence as life was precious to every being, the Buddha advocated non-violence. He urged for peace and reconciliation, understanding and accommodation, moderation and forgiveness. To his relatives who were about to start a war over a water dispute, he asked, "What is more valuable, a drop of blood or water?" The 5 disciplines of avoiding killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, falsehood, and abuse of liquor and drugs were advocated for all as a minimum moral code to ensure order and well-being. The Buddhist ideal of life was couched in the 4 sublime or imponderable states of loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. The goal of spiritual training was the realization of wisdom through mental development based on moral purity. The Buddha's mission lasted 45 years until he passed away at the age of 80 years at Kusinara. By this time, he had set the foundation for his teachings to be compiled, codified, and systematically studied. The Sangha had become a full-fledged educational organization with an enormous capacity to preserve and spread the Buddha's teachings through instruction, as well as substantial literary efforts of explanation and interpretation. A religious infrastructure in the form of well-established monasteries and shrines had also come into being. Thus, 2,550 years ago, the mission of the Buddha was fully consolidated to become the world religion it has now become. What for nearly 300 years remained a regional religion was spread over the then-known Eurasian world by the Mauryan Emperor Asoka. 9 missions sent under his patronage took Buddhism to Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Thailand, as well as to other parts of the Indian subcontinent and the Greek dominions to the west. 3 centuries later, Kushan King Kanishka I facilitated the spread of Buddhism via the Silk routes to Central Asia, from where it went in due course to China Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Buddhism has consolidated itself into three major traditions as Theravada or Southern Buddhism in South and Southeast Asia, Mahayana or Northern Buddhism in East Asia, and Vajrayana or Tantrayana Buddhism in Tibet, Mongolia, and Russia. Preserving intact the central teachings of the Buddha, these traditions and their schools and sects cater for the specific spiritual requirements of nearly 500 million of the world's population. The most spectacular element of Buddhism is its rich and varied cultural heritage, representing significant achievements in literature, art and architecture, and performing arts. The aesthetic creativity inspired by Buddhism is best displayed by such great monuments as Buddha Gaya, Sanchi, Ajanta, and Ellora in India, Anuradhapura, Polonnaruwa, Sigiriya, Maligawila, Dambulla, and Kandy in Sri Lanka, Taxila and Takht-i-Bahai in Pakistan, Bamiyan and Bagram in Afghanistan, Dunhuang, Luoyang, Lesham and Sian in China, Borobudur in Indonesia, Angkor Wat and Bayon in Cambodia, Nara, Kyoto, and Kamakura in Japan, Sakharam in Korea, Hue in Vietnam, Shwedagon and Mandalay in Myanmar, and Ayutthaya and Chiang Mai in Thailand. Equally impressive are the numerous objects of art, especially statues of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas, illustrated manuscripts of Buddhist scriptures, sculptures depicting the life of the Buddha and history of Buddhism, and diverse decorative motifs, which are treasured in many museums on all continents. Buddhism remains the vibrant spiritual force of Asia, where most of the countries have a majority of Buddhists. With the European expansion into Asia, Buddhism was discovered by missionaries and scholars who, over the last 200 years, have contributed to the evolution of Buddhist studies as a major intellectual discipline. From the nursery of the academia, Buddhism has progressively moved to Western society, where an increasing population of admirers and friends of Buddhism pursue both study and practice. Buddhist meditation and chanting have become popular pursuits in their circles. The rapidly increasing Buddhist communities in Europe, Northern and Southern America, and Australia, resulting from the recent diaspora from traditionally Buddhist countries, have added diversity and spiritual enrichment to Western societies. The sheer number of annual publications of books and periodicals on Buddhism in Western languages is an indication of the growing interest in the teachings of the Buddha and their application to problems and challenges of the modern world. Increasingly recognized is the contribution which Buddhism is capable of making to combat violence and insecurity, intolerance and prejudice, and war and criminality in a concerted universal effort to restore peace, harmony, and human dignity. The Buddhists are conscious of their responsibility to mobilize themselves to enable Buddhism to serve humanity. They have established international organizations to serve this purpose. Among them, the World Fellowship of Buddhists in Bangkok, which enjoys operational relations with UNESCO, the World Buddhist University, and Pure Land Learning College in Australia are noteworthy. In all, many hundreds of organizations work regionally and nationally to promote human development through the teachings of the Buddha, which in summary are Sabba Papasa Akaranam, Kusalasa Upasampada, Sasita Pariyodapanam, Etam Buddha Nusasanam. At the opening ceremony, eminent monastics, representatives from international organizations, government leaders, and guests all gave speeches on the significance of this event and their expectations.
联合国这个是召开和平会议从1970年到现在也30多年，这个世界的这个冲突的频率年年上升。我参加了5次这个会议，会后我们跟这些专家学者们聊天，大家都对于和平丧失了信心。这个问题非常严重。为什么失去信心呢？会议的结论都很好。交给联合国了，联合国相信也分发给许多国家做参考。哪一个国家能落实呢？没有国家了会听联合国的话劝导所以我也做了几次主题讲演那么大众都说法师你讲得很好，你的意见很好，可是做不到谁肯去做呢？因此，我们才在中国汤池做了一个试验，用中国传统的方法，中国5000年，你说这么大的国家，这么多的族群，能够长时间维系着和睦相处、平等对待，许多专家学者认为这是奇迹，不可能的事情呢。中国人为什么做到？所以我们就想到中国古人的方法，不是用开会，也不是用镇压，也不是用报复，用什么呢？用教学，办教学，这个方法成功了。所以我们就用这个方法呢，在中国找一个小镇做一个试验，没有想到这个试验呢，出乎我意料之外的成功了。我们原先以为要用3年的时间来教学，没有想到不到1年我们的试验从去年11月开始，今年现在10月，这1年的时间呢，收到非常殊胜的效果。我们新加坡九大宗教像兄弟姐妹一样，一家人可以团结。那么人民是可以教得好的，只要你肯教，以伦理、道德、因果、智慧、科学，好好的来教。要把恶人变成善人，把坏人变成好人，把迷惑的人变成聪明人，把愚痴的人变成智慧的人，把凡人变成圣人，变成佛菩萨，教学就成功了。所以我们通过这个试验，我们就有了信心了。所以人民确实能够 教得好的。
The first day's panel discussion was moderated by the Venerable Dr. Dhammaratana. The topic was Buddhist contributions to culture and human development. The participants were Professor Pasadika of Philipps University, Germany, Professor F. Chenet of the University of Paris 4 Sorbonne, France, Dr. Bongkot Sitapol, President of Maha Mongkol International Buddhist Meditation Center, Thailand, the Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, Director of the Center of Plum Village, France, Professor K. Bhattacharya, Director of CNRS France, and Professor To Sui Hin, Director of the Multi-Faith Center of Griffith University, Australia. They all shared the results of their studies. Professor Ananda Guruge, Dean of the University of the West, California, United States, made a keynote speech entitled The Buddha's Contribution to Humanity and World Peace. He said that Sakyamuni Buddha practiced asceticism to counter greed. He taught his students not only with words, but also through setting good examples with his own behavior. For more than 2,000 years, the Buddha's students have also used this method to continue and